Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Guiding Star Astrology. Today I am speaking with someone who has inspired me so much with his book, the Yugas, looking at the cycles of the ages. And so it's a real honor and a privilege today to have Joseph Selbie here with me at Guiding Star Astrology. Joseph, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, Joseph, you've written a number of fascinating books that mostly combine science and religion, which is something that I just love. And I've only read one of your books, but I can't wait to dig into more of your work. So some of the titles that you've written include The Physics of Miraculous Healing, Break Through the Limits of the Brain, and The Physics of God, which, I mean, these are just fantastic titles, but they're all dealing with um, the emotions, the mind and spirit, and how unlimited we are as beings. And I'm just loving just understanding more and more of the science and religion coming together. Um, for those who aren't familiar with Joseph's work, we met at the CPAC conference, the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, where you were speaking about the Yuga cycles. And if people want to know a little more about Joseph, he's taught yoga and meditation and universal experiential spirituality all over the world. You're a member of the Ananda spiritual movement that's based on the teachings of Yogananda. And would you want to tell us perhaps a little bit more about the work that you've done, particularly coming to perhaps I'll rephrase that question. Tell us about your journey into science and religion and what led you to discovering, how we're so united with the scientific side of things in the physical body and the spiritual coming together.
Well, I was brought up in a very science-oriented family. I like to joke that dinner table conversation required references, that you couldn't just make some casual statement. You had to say how you came to that point of view, or how you learned it, or what the fact is that you're putting forward. And as annoying as that was sometimes, it made me a very logical and thorough sort of thinker about whatever I approach. But it also instilled in me really a lifelong appreciation for science. But then when I went off to college, I had a deep spiritual experience during a hallucinogenic trip.
Was this in the
And
70s or 80s?
this would have been the early 70s.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it really changed me, put my feet on the path to seeking spiritual truth. And I kind of did an about face in my major. I went from being a major in molecular biology to majoring in Indian studies, basically studies of India's history and philosophy and the spiritual basis of their Hindu practices even today. And then I made my way, I feel like it was destined that my steps were guided. I made my way to the teachings of Yogananda, and from there to the teachings of Swami Kriyananda, a direct disciple of Yogananda's. And he had started a spiritual community, which is where I live today. And this community is called Ananda, part of a broader movement that we refer to as the Ananda movement. And we have communities in Seattle, in Portland, in the Bay Area, in LA, on the East Coast, in India, and in Europe now.
Oh,
But it all started
we
with
need
this
one in
one
Australia.
community. Well, there's been several sort of groups that have formed, and expanded a bit and contracted a bit in Australia. As you probably know, Australia has a very sort of different perspective on spiritual teachings, don't want to be told anything, don't want to have, and tend to resist the idea of, conforming to anything. So that's really not the experience of being a part of Ananda.
Yeah.
You don't actually have to conform to anything you don't want to conform to. Yeah. But for people who are a little shy of that, they think you probably will. Somewhere along the line, you're going to have to conform, right?
Yeah.
But we currently have a group that's just outside of Sydney that is trying to kind of generate some community interest. Right now, they just have a center and a handful of people there. But if anybody's interested, you can just Google anandaaustralia.com and see what you find.
That sounds fantastic. I'll be Googling that as soon as this interview is over, because you were telling me before we pressed record and went away with this, the interview, about Ananda, where you are. And it just sounds so glorious. It sounds, to my way of thinking, very Age of Aquarius, which is about community, but yet individuality within the community, able to live the life you want to live in a community type setting, a supportive community setting. Do you want to perhaps share a little bit more about the Ananda community?
Sure. Swami Kriyananda, from the beginning of creating what has grown into this, rather large work all over the world, was always committed to individuals having the freedom to shape their lives the way they wanted to shape them. And still at the same time take advantage of and be inspired by, be blessed by others who are like-minded, who are disciples of Yogananda, and doing things together. We do a lot of meditation together. We do a lot of events together. We own the land together, so there's a sort of a shared stewardship of 600 acres here. But every one of us can and does make their own choices. For example, I've had 4 kids. My wife and I live in a house that we bought here in the community. Others remain single. Some are monastics. Some start their own businesses. Some work for the community. So there's a lot of choices. But the main thing that we have in common is our commitment to the teachings of Yogananda. And that makes it, for me, it has always been very supportive, very powerful, very uplifting to be surrounded by that kind of vibrational support. And that's as true in all our other locations as it is here.
So true. And that being surrounded by good vibrational energy, I mean, this is where things are really going in, I believe, in science and vibrational medicine and everything. So being surrounded by that support and that care and that unity must be just so empowering to be living in that kind of environment.
It definitely is. I mean, I recommend it to anyone. The situation here and in all of our communities is the one element that you do have to conform to, which it's no burden to me, but others it just might not fit their lives as they have it now, is that we ask that everybody be, in fact, a follower of Yogananda, so that it has that concentration of power that comes when large groups of people or even small groups of people do the same thing in the same way.
Yeah.
It is not meant to be a statement that we think Yogananda is the only way you should go, that his teachings are the best teachings and the only teachings, but rather that this combination of focusing on one path with one group has a particular power to it. A lot of people come to visit us who are on other paths or even have a sort of more secular view of things, who just want to learn how we did the sort of the logistics of creating a community, buying land,
Yeah.
starting businesses and stuff. And so I think we've been kind of a seed for many other smaller groups who are uh, interested in another teacher or teachings to help get their kind of community going.
Fabulous. And I have to ask, Joseph, with your scientific family, how did they take it when you started to move into the teachings of Yogananda and take on a more spiritual approach to life?
Well, they don't tell me such, but they probably all still think I'm a little bit around the bend. I have a sweet relationship with my siblings, and my parents are now passed, but even when they were still here, we had a good relationship, but they never really understood
Yeah.
why such a life would attract me.
Yeah.
Because part of the kind of inevitable result of this lifestyle, because it is a life of more simplicity and focus on spiritual things, is that we don't tend to have a lot of extra money.
Mm.
And so my parents were looking on that and saying, well, you're a smart guy. You could go out and start a business or go to work for some big business and you could make lots of money. And they couldn't quite figure out how what I was doing could be more important to me than that kind of success in the world. But over time, I think they kind of at least grew accepting of it, if not understanding.
Yeah. I think a lot of my viewers actually can really identify with that journey, and myself included. I came out of a religious background, and my family aren't in agreement with what I practice in astrology. But like you've alluded to there, when you know what is truth to you and what I believe to be universal truth, you can't pretend or go back to the way you were before and change your behavior just to fit in, just to suit the status quo. It's out of
Right.
alignment then with who you are. So there's a lot of people who watch this channel who have been through a similar journey of discovery relating to astrology that has left their families and former friends and things scratching their heads. So yeah, I can
Yes.
definitely relate. So
Yes. Bemused is the term that comes to mind. They were just bemused by
that's
my life and my choices.
that's right. That's right. And same with my family. They don't understand. But no, it's a conviction, isn't it? The knowledge that
Oh
you're on
yeah.
the path that, well, to our understanding is right. So, um, yeah. But we should perhaps move into talking now about the yugas. Now, this book I picked up at the conference on precession and ancient knowledge. And I just couldn't put it down. I read it the whole way home on the plane from America to Australia. Kept me very entertained on the long trip. And I've highlighted practically everything in here. I've also sent this book out to a number of my friends and recommended it to others. So the title, everybody, is The Yugas, Keys to Understanding Our Hidden Past, Emerging Energy Age, and Enlightened Future. And this actually, the foundation of this book actually comes from the teachings of Yogananda, does it not?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. His teacher, Yogananda's teacher, um, Sri Yukteswar, actually describes the system of the yugas, this cyclical development, waxing and waning cyclical development of human civilization, human consciousness. He wrote a very brief but precise sort of description of it in a book that he wrote called The Holy Science,
Right.
which came out in the 1890s, quite a while ago.
That was Shri
Uh,
Yukteswar wrote that the Holy
yes,
Science. Yes.
yes. And then Yogananda also taught the cycle, and it is described briefly in the autobiography of a yogi.
Mm.
But beyond that, the yugas has been a tradition in India for thousands of years.
Right.
And in fact, the notion that there have been higher ages in the past and that there could be higher ages in our future is one of the very common themes in ancient cultures all over the world. The one that Westerners are most familiar with is the Greek Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. The Norse have it. North American Indians have it. There's some connection. It's not as precise, but there's some connection to it in Australia with the notion of dream time, the Aboriginal view of a higher past. But it's really everywhere in the world in its ancient traditions. But Sri Yukteswar was very precise in the way he described it from the Indian tradition. And it's that precision, particularly the how long each age is and how long the whole cycle is, that I used as the foundation for the book.
It's mentioned in a lot of mythologies as well. I know the book of Daniel in the Old Testament actually refers to this statue with golden age silver, golden head, silver chest, bronze legs, and a mix of iron and clay feet. And very interestingly, in that mythology, the feet are smashed apart and the whole thing comes crashing down, which was a very interesting ending to that particular analogy. But you're well, for people, perhaps we should move into explaining what the yugas are for people who are new to this concept.
Well, let me give you the broad picture. So Sri Yukteswar, who was an astrologer, by the way, of some renown, he describes a 24,000 year cycle, which, if you know about the precession of the equinoxes, which you probably do,
astrologers love cycles. Yes.
Yeah. The precession of the equinoxes as it is understood today by astronomers rather than astrologers necessarily is about 26,000 years long. But Sri Yukteswar hints that the either the rate of precession or the measurement of precession is probably going to end up being closer to 24,000 years when all is said and done. And within that 24,000 years, starting roughly 13,500 years ago, the consciousness of man was at its peak. So that would have been 11,500 BC. And then from that peak, it gradually descended through periods of less awareness of the subtle realities of spirit and of mind and of life force, and finally came into a very materialistic period 12,000 years later, which is 500 AD. So the last descending arc of this circular cycle ended in 500 AD. And then from 500 AD to present, we've gone up through still a material age, but we entered into a more subtle energy age in 1700 AD. And that makes us roughly 300 and some change years into this second yuga where energy is from an outward point of view, it's an age in which we understand energy to be the foundation of matter, where in the lower age, before this, matter was the only thing they understood at all. They didn't really understand this subtle other level of reality. In the age beyond the age we're in, it will be commonplace for people to understand not just energy, but thought. And that in the highest age beyond the age of thought will be the age of understanding the presence of spirit everywhere and in everything. And then it cycles back down again every 24,000 years. So we go from this very high consciousness in what's called Satya Yuga, where mankind as a whole can perceive the presence of spirit. There will always be some people in any age who are not as advanced as others, but in the main, people in Satya Yuga will, actively, innately, clearly perceive the presence of spirit. And then in the age that is less evolved than that, Treta Yuga, it's still a very high age, and mankind as a whole will communicate telepathically, and that they will have the powers of the mind. They will be able to manifest things with their mind. And then it will descend to the age we're in, which is Dwapara Yuga, which
Bronze
is
Age.
an age of energy, and then back into the material age where people only comprehend matter.
So, Joseph, one of the things that I love about how you've described these ages in your book is that you expand upon some of the examples throughout history in the drop-down phase that show how this particular age was working. So, in the last energy age, the last Bronze Age, you give examples of how that yuga outworked in the economy and politics and inventions and so forth. And then the drop down into the Kali Yuga, the lowest age, you share about the certain indications there. So you've broken the whole cycle of different yugas, the descending ages and the rising up ages, into very tangible, real, graspable examples of how the age works. And I found that to be really, really helpful towards gaining an understanding. Do you perhaps want to share about the current age, well, perhaps the Kali Yuga age that we're leaving and the current age that we're in? Is there not a transition period as we cross from one age to another?
Yes. So Kali Yuga, Kali means dark. So it was in a very real way that the dark ages, because mankind's understanding of the reality around them was very limited. And in practical terms, that meant you had animal power, water power, wind power, or people power, but nothing more subtle than that. There was no grasp of things like steam or electricity or any of the things that came along from 1700 to today, which are all energy oriented.
Yeah.
And in our age today, which I just usually refer to as the energy age, because so much of it is focused on harnessing energy to drive a civilization. So we have, we're using petroleum extract from ground to power our cars. We're using solar energy. We're using nuclear energy, and on and on. We're using hydro energy, hydrothermal energy. And it is the enabling key to modern civilization. But there's also something else that's happening that will eventually become the dominant rather than the relatively unknown aspect of Dwapara Yuga. And that is that we're also gaining innately a understanding of subtle energy, of life force. And we see that starting to emerge into our society, into our civilization, in healing. You have things like chiropractic, acupuncture, many kinds of massage are all intending to stimulate subtle energy, life force in the body, and have a healing effect as a result. You also see it manifesting in society in a embrace of yoga postures or of other kinds of physical practices that are, some modern like Pilates and some ancient like yoga. And then in particular, we see people opening to meditation. Meditation is the single most effective way for us to experience subtle energy, to experience our subtle self. So right now, those of us who are embracing these insights and these practices and experiences are by far and away in the minority of the population of the world. And the majority of the population of the world is trying every way they possibly can to exploit outer forms of energy in order to, perhaps make a living or perhaps to get rich, to get by. These are the norms of civilization today. But I think in time, more and more people will embrace the innate subtle energy knowledge that comes with Dwapara Yuga. That's the gift of Dwapara Yuga, if you will. You've probably done this in a group or done this on your own, but if you rub your hands together and then stop and pause and kind of move your hands back and forth, you'll feel something between the palms, right? It's as if something is there.
Yeah.
And I know it, you know it to be life force. It's our subtle energy. But I think, I can't prove this, but I think that in Kali Yuga, if they did that, they wouldn't feel anything.
Yes. So it's a change in consciousness as well as the external outworkings that we see in the world around us.
Right. So it's not just a growth in knowledge, it's a growth in innate ability to perceive.
Yeah.
So in the age after Dwapara that we're currently in, 2,000 years hence, when we get into Treta Yuga, people will innately be aware of their thoughts as things that they can use and that they can manifest things with and they can communicate with. They won't have to have learned it from those of us coming up through Dwapara Yuga. They'll be born with it. And also that's true in Satya Yuga. You'll be born with that innate awareness of spirit.
Yeah.
So the gift in our age, in terms of the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of joy, the pursuit of health, even the pursuit of prosperity, is subtle energy. But a large majority of the people living today haven't tuned into it. They're seeking happiness like mad, right?
Yeah.
But they're not finding it as much as they would like. And when you tune into subtle energy, and particularly when you use it to attune yourself to your own higher consciousness, happiness comes to you from within rather than from without. But they're both, in a very real way, expressions of energy. Just one is inner, one is outer. Now, if you look back, go ahead.
No, please continue.
I was going to say, if we look back to the last descending Dwapara Yuga, and we see how they lived, particularly if we look towards what would have been their end of Dwapara Yuga, which came to an end around 700 BC.
Yeah.
But if we look around 1000 BC, 900 BC, and see what they were practicing,
Mm.
what we will discover is they were practicing subtle energy medicine. They had yoga postures. That's the era in which they evolved.
This is in
And they did
places like
meditation.
Egypt and, you know, all over the world, I guess, too, in Native American
China,
culture.
India, all of the old ancient civilizations
Mm.
had these practices in one form or another.
Yeah.
So what we're experiencing today is because we have the same consciousness, the same inherent level of perception that they had at the end of Dwapara Yuga, we're attracted to the same things.
Yes. Yes.
We're
Absolutely.
attracted to the same practices.
Mm.
So you can see that that pattern. You can also see that pattern in Kali Yuga. There were uh, things that were discovered, quote unquote, by scientists in the medieval times, in the Renaissance times, such as that the sun is the center of the solar system and the earth rotates around it, not the other way around,
Mm.
that actually was known by the Greeks at the beginning of descending Kali Yuga. So that knowledge just got lost for 1,000 or more years. What Renaissance means rebirth.
Yeah. So from the dark age of Kali Yuga,
So
I think our
they
connection's a little unstable there, so sorry to everybody.
were aware that many of the things in the past, sorry,
It's a
so
little
that
unstable, but
they
let's
were
try again.
rediscovering 700,
Mm.
600, 500 BC. Okay,
I think we're back
so
now. So
the
please continue.
masters of the Renaissance. Okay, Galileo and others at the beginning of the descent of Kali Yuga, and that the knowledge was just being reborn in the Renaissance.
Mm. It's truly amazing, you know, that how the cycle repeats. And we'll talk perhaps in a little while about the collapse of the Bronze Age, which, when we're looking at the circle of the Yugas, is actually where we're at right now. But I wanted to ask, I've got a couple of questions. Firstly, I wanted to ask, firstly, are there people from the
Mhm.
Golden Age who are functioning in this lower Dwapara age at the moment, who are living in this high level of consciousness?
Yes, according to Sri Yukteswar and Yogananda, uh, people can have exalted awareness in any age. It's harder to rise to it for the first time, for the first incarnation in a lower age, because you have so little support for that journey. But it is possible because innately we are high spiritual beings, and we tend to get born in the yugas that really support our next step, our next level of growth. But if our next level of growth is in fact self-realization or God realization, and the our teacher, our guru, we can still do that same transformation. Just may be a bit harder.
Yeah, fascinating. Um, yeah, I find that really, really interesting. And I'm wondering if through meditation and yoga practices, people can cultivate that rise in consciousness. And I'm no not sure whether Yogananda talked about this or not, but in our next life, our reincarnation, if we have worked on raising our consciousness level in this incarnation, will we incarnate back at a higher level yuga than coming back in, 50 years time from when we die or something like that?
Right.
What's your opinion on that?
Well, that is almost everyone's favorite question.
I'm not surprised. No one wants to come back in this age.
I think in general that we are likely to reincarnate with sort of families of souls who are evolving together. And so because they're evolving together, they're likely to come back at a time that fits their vibration. So if my spiritual family of today, my Ananda friends and loved ones, reincarnate again, maybe it's in the next stage of Dwapara Yuga from this one. But that next stage could also be in a descending Dwapara Yuga because you're just looking for a similar time of awareness and consciousness to grow and to work out your karma. And Yogananda, through a what do you call it, a bit of a spanner into that works, because he said, you also may incarnate on other planets. That you're not necessarily strictly destined to have all of your earthly incarnations on this planet, and that you might incarnate somewhere else, but the same influence would be true, which is that you'd incarnate where you could learn.
Yes. Yeah. At the current level that your soul is
Right.
at. Yeah.
Right.
How fascinating. I find
So
that.
you don't, as many people were hoping, get to incarnate 20 times and be in Satya Yuga, knowing God in every moment of your life. You might be able to skip that if in this life you attain a very high state of consciousness, and it's always accessible to us.
Yeah.
I mean, Yogananda didn't teach just what you could learn in Dwapara Yuga, and neither did Jesus or Buddha or any other spiritual teachers. They teach you how you can completely transcend physical incarnation. But realistically, and unfortunately, we don't tend to make it all the way every time that we're, embracing a spiritual teaching, and that we may have to go through a few more levels before we attain the highest.
Yeah. But to my mind, and I'd love you to share what your thoughts on this are, Joseph, but to my mind, our golden age self, so to speak, who we may have been in another cycle where our soul was incarnate in the golden age, is always there and accessible, rather than this is just my spiritual understanding, but rather than God, it's our golden age awareness, our golden age consciousness is available to draw from if we want to. I don't know what Yogananda taught on that or what your opinion on that might be.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, he encouraged everyone who tuned into his teachings, as did Jesus, as did Buddha, as did many other spiritual teachers, to achieve the golden age in that life now, this time. I mean, my personal hope is that by deep meditation, I can achieve that golden age this lifetime, because it's within our reach. It's who we are. It's our essence.
That's what I mean.
We
It's part
are,
of us. Yes.
yeah, we don't have to build it. We already are it. It's more that we need to kind of push away what isn't spirit. We need to let go of the perceptions and thoughts and beliefs we have that are keeping us from experiencing that highest of high levels of consciousness. We can, it's our choice. It takes determination and lots of meditation to do it, but it's definitely within our reach.
Yeah.
But even if we don't attain the ultimate in this lifetime, it will propel us with more energy, with more intention into achieving it in another life.
Yes.
So there's nothing lost if you don't make it in one life. It's all gain.
It,
And
it
even
is.
in that life, you become happier, you become healthier, you become more prosperous in the sense of feeling that this world is yours, that everything in this world you are an heir to, that there's, you know, completeness possible in this life that may not be the ultimate, but can be a level of happiness beyond, far beyond even what you currently experience.
Mhm. Brilliant. Now, you alluded to a moment ago cycles within the cycle, like within the Dwapara Yuga, that there's various stages, if you like. Do you want to share a little bit more about that?
Well, it's going to evolve. So there's two answers to this, that within the 2000 and not remembering properly here, the 2400 years we have coming up remaining in Dwapara Yuga, the age is going to advance. So again, if we go and look at the past and look how people were living at the beginning of descending Dwapara Yuga, which would have been, you know, if you can think of it this way, 2,000 years more advanced than we are in our
Yeah.
beginning
Yes.
of Dwapara Yuga. They were a very enlightened age, even though it was in Dwapara. This was the age in which the pyramids were being built.
Mm.
And I
Which were,
believe that,
and they believe energy sources is one theory about the pyramids. Sorry to interrupt.
yeah, that is a common thought. I believe that they were built in order to rapidly advance people's spiritual growth.
Mm.
That they focused subtle energy in a way that if you were ready for it, you could advance a lot.
Mm.
And that they were surrounded by what is often referred to as an initiation school, and that people lived around the pyramids rather than in, and went through their spiritual training. And when they were ready, they were taken to various chambers
Mm.
in the various pyramids. Perhaps they meditated in them for days. Perhaps they were only in briefly, but that it was a way of um, speeding up spiritual advancement
Mm.
because they were coming from an age of Treta Yuga before their descent into Dwapara Yuga, where they still would have had very close memories of higher levels of consciousness.
Mm.
We come into our Dwapara with basically no memories of
Yeah.
higher consciousness, you know, no cultural or societal memories, where they would have come into descending Dwapara with quite a bit of appreciation for their having been higher consciousness in the past. And so their first goal, if you will, was to try to hang on to that higher consciousness as much as they could.
Mm.
So they use things like the pyramids. And it's, you read it in various psychic works,
Mm.
like Initiation by Elizabeth
I
Heitch.
was going to mention that book. I love that book.
Yeah. Yeah. If you read her with the yugas in mind, she has a
Mm.
very clear picture of these ages that she talks about.
Yeah.
But one of the things that she says is that the family of the pharaohs, who were the primary ones being taught in these initiation schools, were being taught because pharaohs were expected to be realized.
Mm.
pharaohs were expected to have a very high level of consciousness and not just be the next in line of a hereditary chain of rulers. And now eventually degraded as Dwapara Yuga descended into hereditary rule. But at the beginning of Dwapara Yuga, they were self-realized beings who were ruling the kingdom of Egypt.
Often the priests and the pharaohs were from the same family and went through the same training, didn't they?
Yeah.
So interesting.
So in terms of your original question, I digressed quite a bit. There would be gradations of advancement going forward from where we are, as just as there were, loss of gradations in the previous. So the next step for me might be that I appear in my next incarnation 50 years from now, and that is perfect for me because Dwapara will have advanced a little, and I can take advantage of that advance. But there's also, when you mention cycles within cycles, a good friend of mine, whose spiritual name I can't remember, but his name that he writes under or has been writing under is David Frawley. He's a Vedic astrologer.
Wonderful.
Well, he came up with cycles within cycles, literally, as a way of seeing how those stages might develop. So the first part of Dwapara Yuga might be Dwapara.
Yeah.
And then the second part, this is just like the dashas, right?
Yeah,
they have bhuktis and sub-bhuktis in them, so too the yugas could have them.
That makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Really? Yeah. Yeah, that the dasha system is the 120-year long lifespan, but this would be a cycle within cycle type dasha system that's, what is it, 2000. Well, the yugas are varying lengths, aren't they? The Kali Yuga is the shortest, and the Dwapara Yuga is about 3,000 years.
Yeah, they roughly go down 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, 1,000.
Yeah.
But because Satya Yuga coming up, if you will, meets Kali Yuga going down, you could say that Kali Yuga is 8,000. And with the transition periods, it's actually 9,600 years. And then
the Kali Yuga, the lowest stage.
The Kali Yuga's transition periods are 400 years on either end of the 4,000. So it's 4,800 times 2, 9,600. So you have this long period, which I always find somewhat reassuring that most of the cycle of the earth is in high consciousness. Because Treta Yuga is 3,000 plus its 2 transition periods of 300 on either end. So it's 3,600 years, and it's a very high age. It's just not as high as Satya Yuga. So like 2/3 of the cycle, I would be interested in living in, just to and be in an age where people communicated telepathically and could manifest things with their minds. And of course, in Satya Yuga, where you could be communing with spirit as just as naturally as you breathe air.
I find it encouraging to think if the current Dwapara Yuga started in the 1700s, which, looking at all the historical events in the 1700s, is pretty likely, that we're almost at the end of the transition, which is encouraging to me for my current incarnation.
Yes, according to Sagittarius, we actually are at the end. That we went into what he called Dwapara proper in 1900.
Right. That makes sense with all the advancements we've had in the last 100 years.
Particularly in our understanding of energy.
Yeah, of course.
Sagittarius said societally, culturally, scientifically, And he was writing this prior to 1900. He was writing this in the 1890s.
So he was writing prophetically then about
He
this.
was writing prophetically. He said that one of the first things that would happen in the beginning of Dwapara proper is that mankind as a whole would realize that energy is the underpinning of all matter. So in 1905, Einstein published his E equals mc squared, which is basically saying that in mathematical terms, that there really is no such thing as matter. It's only energy behaving as matter. And then from that, we see quantum physics. And from quantum physics, we see string theory. We
Nikola
see
Tesla's
solar energy,
work.
nuclear energy. And Sri Yukteswar basically predicted that this early part of Dwapara Yuga would be, as he put it, a rapid expansion of knowledge in all departments.
Yeah, fabulous. So that probably leads into one of my next questions, which is, you mentioned in the beginning that the about 1100 to 11,500 years ago, that we had the beginning of the drop down out of the golden age. Now, some researchers put forward that we went through a catastrophe at that time, and that maybe a comet smacked into the earth. I know Graham Hancock talks a lot about that being the age when we went through a catastrophe, and a lot of the ancient knowledge was lost then. What's your perspective on that concept and how it aligns with the cycle of the yugas?
I think there's no doubt that there have been catastrophes on a global scale in the past, and there will be in the future. A lot of writers, thinkers try to sync those up with transitions from one yuga to another. But I have to say, I have not found the evidence to be as knowable as you would need it to be to make that claim.
Right.
That there's certainly evidence of past catastrophes, but there's the missing the name, a huge volcanic eruption that happened
Santorini?
72,000 years ago.
Was that Santorini?
72,000 would be, a multiple of 24,000 years. So 3 cycles ago. But we haven't had a gigantic global catastrophe, volcanic eruption lately. We came close with Krakatoa, but still Krakatoa was a minor compared to what Pinatubo was. So I find it hard to link them up.
Yeah,
Or
interesting.
to think that they're caused by changes of consciousness or loss of consciousness. I think that we're living on the back of Gaia, and Gaia is a conscious being. Gaia is a mother, but our influence over Gaia may not be so much that we cause her to have these huge catastrophes because we've changed our minds. There are much longer cycles that the Earth is going through evolutionarily that could cause those kind of events.
What about? Oh, sorry.
But I was going to say, a lot of times people are looking for, authors like Graham Hancock, who is a good friend of mine and somebody whose work I really respect, who make these connections between the Ice Age ending and civilizations being washed away or destroyed by this, sudden change. But I think during the Ice Age, so I differ with a lot of authors like Graham Hancock. I think during the Ice Age, there was a much smaller population of people on the earth. If you just look back sort of demographically to how many people there would have had to have been 10,000 years ago in order for there to be as many people as there are today, that there was a small population on the earth even during the Ice Age. And where would they have lived?
Around
They
the
wouldn't have lived in the polar regions. They
no.
would have lived around the equator where it was toasty and warm. And in fact, if you look at evidence for what climate was like around the equator 10,000 years ago, it was much more temperate because of the ice ages. The whole earth was cooler. So it would have been grasslands around the equator rather than inhospitable, too hot to survive kind of conditions like you tend to find today. And most of the evidence for civilizations, even going back 3 and 4 and 5,000 years, is they all were relatively close to the equator and would have been unaffected by the melting of glaciers. They would have been unaffected by that rise in temperature unless they lived on the coast. And there is a lot of evidence of basically flooded
submerged cities and things like that.
cities around most of the continents. But would that have been enough to wipe out entire civilizations? I tend to not think so. I think it would have been a catastrophe, yes, but it would not have, as Graham Hancock posits, knocked mankind back to a very basic knowledge of life. That they kept the knowledge that they had from that time, and they would have rebuilt with it, according to my understanding of the yugas and of the past.
So interesting, Joseph. You know, you talked just a moment ago about keeping the knowledge and rebuilding and what have you. There would have been, to my understanding, in those, like the dropping down, the fall, as I think it's referred to in biblical scriptures, the fall of mankind, the fall of consciousness, a knowledge that of the cycle that we're going back down again. And so they would have had an awareness, I think, of, okay, a lot of our wisdom and our knowledge is going to be lost. How are we going to preserve this for future generations to keep, to help it come back when the rise up
Right.
occurs? And
Right.
that's why I think things like myths like the Odyssey are speaking about this drop down and warning against certain things that will be seen and that will happen in the drop down into the Kali Yuga over that 10-ish thousand year period, such as the rise of oligarchies instead of looking at communal support and living in love and light with equality. That was one of the main themes in the Odyssey, that talks about the suitors, and there's 108 of them, which is a celestial number. So there's been ways that they have encoded and hidden this ancient knowledge for future generations. And so I'm wondering your thoughts on that idea as well.
There's a lot of references, as you say, buried in mythology and lore and in spiritual teachings that have survived over that long period. And I think for exactly the reason you're saying, that they wanted to leave a legacy. So one of the most common mythic stories in every ancient tradition around the world is the tradition that there was a heaven on earth, that there was an Eden, that there was a golden age, that there was a place where, it was paradise. But if you look,
Color, Avalon, every ancient
yeah,
culture. Has a, yeah.
But if you look closely at how they describe paradise, you begin to see that there's a teaching in there, just as you suggested with the 108 suitors. And also in the Odyssey, there's the, in order to prove himself worthy, prove himself to be Odysseus, he had to shoot the arrow through the axe handles, or through the, whatever the hole in the axe is called. And Yogananda said that this is symbolic of drawing your energy up through the spine
Oh, wow.
into higher consciousness and focusing it at the point between the eyebrows. And that's what it takes to, realize yourself as Odysseus, to realize yourself as the highest that you are. But in the myths of paradise, one of the things they share is that they all have something in the center. So in the Edenic myths of paradise, they have a tree. In the Middle Eastern ones, they have the axis mundi. They have this axis of life.
Oh.
And so what is being conveyed, more than that there was a paradise, and not so much that there is a particular place that used to be paradise, but that it's an inner teaching, that if you go within the tree of life, which is the spine, if you go into the axis mundi and you raise yourself up to the heights, you're in paradise. You're in paradise because you're in bliss, because you're in oneness with God. So there are many, many things that have come down to us. The most overt is the Yugas. The Vedas. The Vedas are had been written down at the beginning of descending Dwapara, but they had been an oral tradition for unknown thousands of years before that. And if you do a look, and many experts have done this, what's called archaeoastronomy, if you look at the descriptions of stellar and planetary positions when certain events happened, such as Atri's eclipse. And Atri's eclipse is the most famously described of those events. And as you probably appreciate, for its entire history, the Vedas have not only had the 12 positions of the zodiac, but they've also had the 29 nakshatras, the positions of the moon. And this, when they're described, that such and such planet is in the 25th nakshatra, which I know has a Sanskrit name describing the 25th, but I don't know what it is. But when that is described in detail, you can get a very precise idea of what all the planetary positions would have been at that time against the background of stars in particular. And using that ancient description, what they have found is that the Atri's eclipse could have been 7600 BC.
Right.
Could have been thousands of years earlier, and in fact, all the way into the beginning or end of descending Satya Yuga.
Yeah.
So I feel that the Vedas, which have lasted intact for 10,000, 11,000 years, by a very exacting oral tradition of how they should be chanted, they really haven't degraded, nor has Sanskrit as a language degraded. That is one of the biggest legacies of the past. And the tradition is that they were handed down by the rishis, by fully enlightened teachers that lived in Satya Yuga and on into Treta Yuga, who were passing on the highest of high teachings to those who were are going to be coming after them, but also in this descending arc.
Mm.
And to this day, Sanskrit is the most accurate language on earth.
Mm.
It's the most precise. It has the most declinations. It has the most conjugations. It has the most precise pronunciation. It has 50 sounds. It doesn't have letters per se, as we think of them in most alphabets today. It has 50 sounds, which can be combined into different symbols, and that those can be precisely intoned even today based on this long tradition, so that spoken Sanskrit is said to be an expression of the actual meaning of the words. It's vibrationally
Ah,
that meaning, rather than a meaning that has just been stuck onto it over time, like English is full of those kind of examples. We're just from Anglo-Saxon, an axe was called an axe, right? So now
yeah.
we call it an axe, and we know it's this chopping device. But in the high ages in the past, they would have been able to create words that vibrating with the meaning they were meant to have.
So is that why in the Golden Age and the Silver Age, because sorry, I referred to them with the Western terminology,
Sure.
yeah, um, that things were orally passed on rather than written?
Well, I think that's part of it. I also think that in this case, in the example of the Vedas and Sanskrit, is they were passed on to an age in which they communicated mentally.
Mm. Yes, with telepathy and so forth. Yeah.
So speech would have probably been available to them,
Mm.
but I imagine that it was clumsy in comparison to being able to communicate telepathically.
Yeah.
Telepathically, you could probably, as I believe those who can do it today would attest, it packs more meaning into the exchange. It can it can convey words, it can convey images, it can convey feeling all at once in an exchange from mind to mind,
Yeah.
where words are, clunky
Limited.
in comparison to that.
Yeah.
So I would think that would be the preferred way that
Yeah.
they communicated,
Yeah.
and that they could communicate the Vedas to each other in that manner as well. And then eventually, when mankind lost the ability to communicate telepathically, that's when there was the explosion of languages that
Mm.
we know today on the earth. And that's also where the myths of the Tower of Babel come from, where
Yeah.
suddenly people couldn't understand each other,
Yeah.
and that things fell apart because they just couldn't communicate it as they had. And it
Mm.
was probably a rather, laborious process of um, pulling these languages together so that they could communicate. And
Yeah.
then they were also starting to not remember as well as they did in Treta Yuga. So they had to start writing things down,
Of course.
keeping records. And for that, they had to come up with alphabets. And you can see this all around the world, right around 3000 BC, which is the beginning of descending Dwapara Yuga.
Mm.
Almost all the languages that we know today, in the form we know them today, including the Chinese languages, Middle Eastern languages, etc., Egyptian, they all started to kind of form in a hard way, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. That myth of the Tower of Babel makes it sound like it happened in an instant, like all of a sudden, oh, we can't communicate. But the reality probably is that it took quite a while for that to disintegrate, that capacity to disintegrate. Would that be right?
I would think so.
Mm. Yeah. And I'm so fascinated by your mention a moment ago of archaeoastrology, which is just such an amazing field, made all the more accessible to us now since we have computer technology to be able
Right.
to plug in dates and get certain alignments of planets that would have been around at certain stages in history. From an astrological point of view, there's so much that we can learn about what we're about to go through or where we're heading predictively, by being able to do that and look at our deep ancient past, which
Right.
I get so excited about. And on that topic, recently on the Astrolata channel, one of my other Astrolata colleagues there shared the most amazing insights she'd done with archaeoastrology, and I've kind of got it here behind me. Or perhaps I'll just take a moment to explain. Currently, we are in a period of time, it lasts roughly about 10 years, when the three outer celestial planets, the three planets invisible to the naked eye that we need a telescope to see, and therefore corresponding to our consciousness of mankind rather than the physical, the visible planets which correspond to our tangible material life, are in this alignment here. We've got Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and they're going to hold this formation for a couple of years yet, which is known as either a bisextile triangle or a minor grand trine. And this is a very powerful configuration between these three celestial planets that hasn't occurred according to, I think it's Rochelle from Astrolata, hasn't occurred since the collapse of the Bronze Age, which is what, about 1100 years BC?
Right.
I'm right there?
Or a little later, 10,
10,
a
okay,
thousand,
1,000 years.
to 700.
Yeah,
It's a rough,
period. Yeah,
roughly
yeah,
defined term.
yeah. And so to my mind, when I heard her talking about this amazing piece of archaeoastrology that she'd done, I just, my mind immediately leapt, Joseph, to your work on the Yugas because, and I think I had it marked here, um, yeah, on page 292, you talk about the collapse of the Bronze Age being the reflection of where we're at now. I don't know if this is any helpful, if people can see that particular diagram there that's on this page, showing the drop down from the Bronze Age down to the Kali Yuga, and then the rise back up in consciousness that we're going through at the moment, which is the exact mirror reflection of the I hope that helped people to see that, of the Bronze Age. So I found that very, very exciting to think about that. And so I just want to pick your brain, Joseph, about what was going on at the collapse of the Bronze Age that is now we're seeing reflected, also in society now that we might be living through.
Yeah, it was quite a uh, thorough house cleaning, if you will, at the end of descending Dwapara. There were a lot of civilizations like the Cassanites and the Hittites and the Assyrians, and actually the list goes on, who had fairly flourishing empires close to one another in the Middle East, who, one reason or another, completely failed. They tended to go to war with each other and destroy each other. The Egyptians conquered a lot of them. Other civilizations also in South America, like the Olmecs, or um, very powerful dynasties in the areas of India and China, also collapsed at this time. So it wasn't just the Middle East. But by the end of descending Dwapara Yuga, in that 300 years or so, many civilizations just disappeared, and they were more or less taken over by a handful of other civilizations. but it didn't happen all at once. There was this, constant change. The Cassanites would become part of the Hittites or whatever. I'm sure I'm getting that wrong, but that it was a rapid sort of reordering of who was in power all over the world. And then it ended more or less at 700 BC. And this has become known as the collapse of the Bronze Age because it was so widespread. Now we're in the beginning of that same kind of zone of our Dwapara Yuga, which is the beginning for us and the end for the descending cycle. And we're seeing similar rapid change, geopolitical change in the world. Maybe the most dramatic one that we know from, our lives today is we had the Soviet Union. We had Russia take over all these countries around it as satellites. And then we had the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and it became Russia and aligned countries. We had the Iron Curtain, and then the Iron Curtain went away. Africa has also gone through a bewildering amount of change in that period, going back to around 700 or 1700, because of the colonial era, where previous civilizations were taken over by the British or the French or the Spanish, and then they were abandoned. That this kind of upheaval, change, rapid change, is still going on, and I think could keep going on for quite some time yet, until kind of a new order, a new way of governing
comes in,
establishes itself.
I agree. You've got written here, self-interest, this is talking about back in the Bronze Age and the correspondence to today, self-interest became fixated on material gain, thus ensued a sort of worldwide land grab, and in the process, great destruction. And often these land grabs are about energy resources. So, the mineral sands in Canada and so forth that we know that corporations have their eye upon for energy and gas and so forth, that are becoming the big chips on the table, so to speak, for a lot of countries at the moment. So we've got the combination of energy again for the Dwapara Yuga, and the self-interest that I think is evident in the beginning of the Dwapara Yuga as well, that we will gradually evolve out of that self-interest that is...
Yes, and I believe so. We could have some messy times in the process of that upward evolution rather than the downward devolution. Because, as you say, we have this sort of theme of self-interest that runs all the way through Dwapara, only I believe in the higher parts of Dwapara, it becomes enlightened self-interest, but it's still a theme. Right now, our self-interest is not very enlightened.
No.
And we see a lot of political decisions being made that are really, as you say, land grabs, power grabs, resource grabs, and they're being done because they can be done, not because it is moral or helpful or legal.
Yeah, very, very interesting times, isn't it? I just sort of perhaps veering off that topic for a moment. There is always in mythology the talk of Saturn being the ruler of the Golden Age, and that he goes away to sleep under the ocean at Ojija or something for a period of time and then comes back. What do you think about sort of rulership or governance in the higher ages? You know, it's always been intriguing to me because from an astrological point of view, and so I don't know whether you can answer this or not, but Saturn is considered the great malefic in Vedic astrology, and
Right.
yet is the ruler of this highly enlightened age. How does that correspond? It seems at odds, if you know what I mean. Are you able to wade into those waters at all, Joseph?
Well, this is the first time I've encountered this, so my mind is rapidly sifting through what I might be able to understand of it. Now, I've displayed some knowledge of astrology and Vedic astrology, but I am by no means a trained Vedic astrologer. But the first thought that came to me was Saturn was a friend of mine who is a Vedic astrologer. Drupada McDonald says to me when he reads my chart all the time, is that Jupiter kind of gives us the vision and the possibility, but Saturn manifests it.
Yes, he's so right. Yes, absolutely.
So maybe Saturn being the ruler of the higher age just means that it's set, it's orderly.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Now, this is just a huge leap and guess on my part, but that's the only way I can make sense of it. Because otherwise, as you say it, you would think it would be Jupiter ruling
That's
Satya
right.
Yuga.
That's right. Yes, that's why I've always questioned this because currently in the Kali Yuga, we're in the age of Pisces, which is ruled by Jupiter in the traditions. And to my
Uh-huh.
mind, Jupiter is not a Kali Yuga type uh, governance, you know. So I've been a little confused by that. And if you can't answer that because it is an astrological question, so I totally understand. But I appreciate your insights about rule and order and regulation and structure, which is Saturnian energy. So that makes sense.
Right, right.
Mm.
That's, I think, all I've got.
I think that's wonderful.
That's
It's
been
helped a
explained to me.
lot. Really helped a lot. Well, Joseph, what are you working on right now? Like you've got all these amazing books that I'm going to be digging into in the future now that I've read the Yugas book. What are you working on now? Are you researching a new book or looking at anything in particular that is new and interesting?
Well, I just published relatively recently the Physics of Miraculous Healing.
Ooh,
It came out in August of last year. And so now I'm putting together some programs to take people through not just the sort of physics of the physics of miraculous healing, but the keys to uh, unlimited healing, self-healing powers that it indicates that we have, that physics supports,
yes.
as well as spiritual teachings, and put those into kind of a workshop experiential format so that
Wonderful.
people can experience that. So I have a few places scheduled, and one in Sacramento, one here at Ananda at our Expanding Light retreat, but I will be doing it in other places as well. So mainly I'm trying to, you know, keep the energy moving for that book. I'm not working on another book yet, but it'll be inevitable. I like
Wonderful.
to.
You're a wonderful writer, and it's such a joy to read your work. So, um,
Thank you.
and I mean, David, my husband, and I often toss around the idea of organizing a conference or a retreat in Australia with people and speakers that are
Hmm.
on the similar wavelength, if you like. So when we get our act together on that, we would love to have you come down to Australia and perhaps share your workshop down here with us and speak further about the yugas and the yuga cycle. If
Yeah,
you're willing
I'd
to
love to
come
come.
with us.
I've always had this thought that I was going to go to Australia sooner or later. And
Mm.
right now it's later because I haven't gone yet. But the connection of my wife having been born in Australia, and I have good friends from the Ananda work who have gone to Australia to do various things. And I seem to have connected with people like yourself and other interviewers in Australia.
Yeah.
So I feel like I will go at some point, and maybe you'll be the catalyst
I
to
hope
get me down
so.
there.
I hope so. And if anybody's watching who wants to leave a comment in the comments section about their availability to come, please do. We'd love to get an idea of whether something like that would be popular and successful. But yes, Joseph, that would be such a delight to show you around Australia and to be able to pick your brain further about all this wonderful information.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'd love to come.
yeah. I want to thank you so much for your time today and for sharing these insights with us. I think it actually gives, well, it always gives me great hope to think about the Yuga cycle and that we are actually moving upwards to a greater level
Right.
of vibration, a greater level of consciousness, and leaving the Kali Yuga dark age behind. Oh, I did have one last thing I wanted to ask about. What do you think is causing this cycle? I have heard, perhaps it was from Walter Cruttenden, I'm not sure where I heard it first, but that it's a binary star cycle system that causes the rise and the fall that occurs. I should have asked that a long time ago in the beginning of this interview.
Right. This is Sri Yukteswar's explanation. So, again, I'm not an astronomer. I don't exactly know what the solution would be, although I know a lot of people like Walter and my co-author, David Steinmetz of the book, who have really looked into the science of how this could be. But what Sri Yukteswar says simply is that we are, we being our solar system, are rotating around our binary or our dual,
Mhm.
that there's another gravitational body that we have, that the solar system has a connection to. And we're doing this celestial do-si-do, and we complete the do-si-do every 24,000 years.
Mhm.
And in the process of going through that orbit, if you will, we get closer to and further from the seat of Brahma, as he described it, the seat of creative power. And therefore, when we're closer to the seat of creative power, we're in the golden age.
Yes.
And then when we're farther from it, we go back into the dark age.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a lot there to unpack, and we could spend an entire show trying to unpack what that is and where that source might be, and has this dual ever been found? But it would be a lot to unpack in a few minutes.
Yeah, well, we'll just have to come back and do another interview at some point.
Sure.
That would be fun. Well, thank you once again, Joseph, so much for all your insights and for this wonderful conversation. It's been such a joy to connect with you here. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure, and we'll get together and talk about the actual astronomical cycles at some point in the future. Thank you so much.
God bless.
You too.